Two doctors in the same city evaluating the same patient don't necessarily reach the same conclusion. Daniel Kahneman asked, why is it that for the same problem, two brilliant minds can come up with two different conclusions? Why does disagreement arise not only among the ignorant and biased, but also among highly trained professionals working within the same system and sharing the same data pool? Is the most dangerous thing in human thought not when we are wrong, but when we don't know how we are wrong? If you've ever believed that intelligence and rationality help people make better decisions, this book will force you to reevaluate every assumption. Noise, a flaw in human judgment, not only illuminates systematic biases, but also opens the door to an often unnamed realm, the invisible yet powerful fluctuations within our own thinking apparatus. Not all errors can be prevented, but if we don't know where we're deviating, we'll never know what needs fixing. And that's precisely why this book is worth starting, not to foster more trust, but to cultivate methodical skepticism. Let's begin the summary of this book. Part 1: The Search for Noise. When I was a young consultant, I once witnessed a criminal trial in a district court in the western United States. A man was accused of car theft. Nothing unusual until I discovered something shocking. If he were judged by Judge A, the sentence might be only 6 months probation, but if the presiding judge was Judge B, the man could be sentenced to 5 years in prison. The same act, the same charge, the same court, yet the sentence could differ so dramatically not because one of the judges was unjust, but because they differed randomly. I began to realize that something was quietly operating beneath the surface of decisions we considered rational. Something that wasn't bias, wasn't ethics, wasn't ignorance, a silent error unnoticed by anyone but permeating everywhere, in courts, in hospitals, in banks, and even in my own mind. I called it noise. We live in a world organized around the expectation of consistency. A doctor will diagnose the same illness in the same way if two patients have identical symptoms. A juror will award the same score if reading the same essay. An insurance company will offer the same premium if two clients have similar profiles. But in reality, this doesn't happen. And it was this invisible deviation between decisions that kept me awake for many nights. I began to search for answers, not just through theory but through data, through real experiments. My colleague, Le, and I collected thousands of decisions within the same system. We sought out places where people believed decisions were made with the highest precision: judges, medical experts, investors, large corporations, and we found noise everywhere. It's not bias. Bias is a directional deviation, like when you judge others through the lens of gender or racial prejudice. But noise is different. It's an unpredictable fluctuation, like static interfering with music, making the melody unclear. In one experiment, we showed multiple doctors a series of X-ray images and asked them to assess the severity of the disease. The results stunned us. A patient could be rated as high risk by one doctor and needing no intervention by another. Not because they lacked competence, but because they are human. Humans are inconsistent, and that's a hard truth to swallow. But wait, if that's normal, why is it alarming? Because this inconsistency causes losses not just financial, but to dignity, trust, and justice. A bank loan applicant might be rejected simply because the credit officer didn't sleep well that night. A patient's treatment might be delayed because the doctor was affected by a previous phone call. An employee might be rated lower simply because the interviewer was hungry. These are not exceptions. They are a systemic part of how we make decisions. I recall a case at a large insurance company where we were allowed to conduct a noise audit. We had multiple specialists evaluate the same insurance policy without knowing others were doing the same. They all had the same training, the same software, and strict procedures. But when we compared the results, the discrepancies amounted to thousands of dollars. And that was considered normal within that organization. You might think, oh, it's just humans, no one is perfect. But if you are the recipient of that decision, the patient, the borrower, the employee, how would you feel knowing your fate hinges solely on noise? So how do you measure noise? That question haunted us for years. We developed a technique called the noise audit, a tool to measure the degree of fluctuation in human judgments. And the results from organizations thought to have the best control systems were precisely where noise permeated the most. Noise is not easily recognized like bias. It has no face, no ideology, no political orientation. It is a trackless deviation. It doesn't stand out, but it accumulates into something colossal. Imagine a court where sentences can fluctuate by up to 50% simply due to the weather, the judge's mood, or fatigue. A healthcare system where diagnoses change just because of who is on call. A financial market where investment decisions are influenced by how light hits a screen. All of these are not hypotheses, they are realities. And as we delved deeper, we discovered something even more alarming. Every organization underestimates its own level of noise. Because noise doesn't cause scandals, it doesn't explode. It quietly erodes quality little by little, like an ever-present white noise in the decision-maker's mind. That's why I believe if you don't detect noise in your system, it's not because it's absent, but because you haven't learned how to listen. We began our next experiment with a simple assumption. If humans are measuring instruments, how much deviation will that instrument produce when measuring the same object? In physics, you can take a ruler and measure a length of string multiple times and know where the error lies. But humans don't measure with their eyes or hands. They measure with intuition, memory, mood, and immediate experience. And the result is they always deviate, with no discernible pattern. In a large study at a global executive recruitment firm, we found that recruiters evaluated candidates differently not because they had different strategic perspectives, but because they came from different cities. Someone from New York might find a candidate too soft, while the same candidate is deemed to have leadership potential by someone from Los Angeles. No common standard, just noise. In the U.S. justice system, there's a classic study of federal judges. When shown the same criminal case file, the sentences they handed down varied by almost double. One influencing factor was lunchtime. When judges were hungry, sentences were harsher. When full, they were more lenient. We're not making this up. It's data, it's reality, it's the human system operating daily. And what chills me is not this imperfection, but how the system accepts it as normal. When we shared our research findings, many within organizations simply said, "Oh, that's just human nature." But that's not true because we can do better. It's just that no one has pointed out that we need to do better. You see, if two analysts value a startup and their results differ by 30%, people might consider it normal. But if two scales weigh a bag of rice and differ by 30%, you'd call one of them broken. Meanwhile, the human mind, the very instrument of judgment, is breaking every day, and no one calls for a fix. We call this the illusion of consistency, a false belief that if you put a good enough person in the right position, they will make the same decision in the same circumstances. In reality, even they themselves, if put in that situation twice, would make two different decisions. In an experiment organized by our team, experts were asked to make risk assessments for surgical cases. After a few weeks, we had them reevaluate the cases. This time, they were cases they had previously done, but disguised by changing patient names, photos, and minor irrelevant details. The result: the discrepancy between the two evaluations reached 40% not because they lacked expertise, but because they are human, and humans can fluctuate simply due to the weather on a given day. What I discovered is that every decision is noisier than we imagine. And this has huge consequences not only for decision quality, but also for fairness, social trust, and the design of human-operated systems. Imagine a child rejected from school simply because the admissions officer was feeling sluggish due to traffic. A startup founder rated poorly because the investor had just argued with their partner that morning. An inmate receiving a longer prison sentence because their trial took place after a lunch break. These things are happening, and we call it normal. No, it's not normal. It's a systemic failure. Not because no one is working hard, no one is ethical, no one is qualified, but because even the best, smartest, most dedicated individuals are not immune to noise, and the system fails to detect it. What troubled me most during years of research was not the presence of noise, but the absence of awareness of noise in every organization. No unit measures it, no one tracks it, no one is held accountable if it increases. Meanwhile, the world is obsessed with bias, as if that were the only cause of deviation. Bias has a path, a goal, a story to tell. Noise does not. It carries no voice, no political stance. It's like white noise in an audio system. You only notice it once you've experienced silence. And that's why I believe if you've never tried to measure noise in your system, you are making decisions in the dark. I remember the first time we presented the concept of noise at a board meeting of a large corporation. No one in the room refuted our arguments. They nodded. Some even applauded. But then, as if a reflex, a board member who had previously headed an HR department asked, "But if noise is always present and cannot be completely eliminated, what's the point of caring about it?" I didn't answer immediately. I looked him straight in the eye and asked, "If a doctor knows that their diagnosis might change simply because it's raining that day, should they continue as if nothing is happening?" He fell silent. The issue isn't whether we can completely eradicate noise. The issue is whether we dare to look at it as a systemic flaw instead of accepting it as part of human nature. We realized that no profession, no system, no matter how thoroughly trained, is free of noise. In a study on stock underwriting, IPO valuation analysts who are paid millions of dollars showed levels of noise in their 3-month stock price forecasts almost equivalent to random fluctuations. Smart people, working in teams, using complex models, still exhibited noise as usual. And the paradox lies here. The more expertise, the more people feel immune to deviation. Like talented musicians who don't realize they're playing offbeat when the stage is noisy. Part of the reason is that we lack clear feedback mechanisms. When a doctor makes a mistake, the patient doesn't return. When an investor makes a wrong forecast, the market continues to operate. When a manager misjudges a candidate, the consequences aren't immediate. And so, we don't learn from noise. Imagine you are an architect, and every time you make a design mistake, the building collapses. You would learn very quickly. But if the building only tilts slightly or sinks after 10 years, you wouldn't know that you were ever wrong. That is the nature of noise. It hides itself in delay and silence. We began to call for organizations to conduct what we called a noise audit, a process where multiple independent experts evaluate a hypothetical situation, and then the results are compared to measure the level of noise. Many within the system initially resisted, fearing they would be exposed as inconsistent. But when the results were published, the more alarming truth was that everyone was equally noisy. And that was the starting point for improvement. When a system knows it is noisy, it will begin to design processes to reduce noise, not by controlling people, but by building more transparent decision structures, more cross-checks, and sometimes by taking people out of the loop. No, I am not advocating for a world where all decisions are made by algorithms. But I advocate for a world where we are honest with ourselves about the imperfection of human judgment. And the last thing I want to say in this part is this. If you are a decision maker, whether a doctor, manager, director, judge, or simply a parent, you shouldn't just ask, "Am I right?" But also, would I be the same person if I did this again tomorrow? If the answer is no, that is noise. And if you recognize that, you've taken the first, courageous step on the journey to make your world of decisions more accurate, more fair, and less noisy. Part 2. Your mind is a measuring tool. There's a paradox I've carried throughout my career. The human brain is an amazing machine, yet incredibly poor at repeating itself. We are trained to believe that judgment is the highest expression of intelligence. But no one teaches us that this intelligence, no matter how brilliant, can still produce indeterminate errors, like a compass placed near a magnet. In this section, I want to lead you into the very core of the problem. Human thinking is not just biased. It fluctuates, it drifts, it deviates without pattern, and more than bias, it is the noise in our thinking that quietly and thoroughly destroys systems. We often envision thinking as a measuring tape, a tool to measure the world. But this tape is not rigid, not straight, and most importantly, not stable. Today you find someone trustworthy, tomorrow you find something suspicious about them. The same situation, the same facts, but the conclusion changes simply because you slept poorly last night. Imagine you're a senior manager tasked with evaluating a potential investment project. Data, reports, financial analysis, all are ready. But in your mind, a previous meeting where your boss criticized you is swirling. Your mood is not good. You don't realize it affects your decision, but you suddenly doubt the optimistic numbers in the report. You start scrutinizing assumptions. You request additional rounds of checks, and ultimately, you delay the decision. It sounds reasonable, but if your mood were different that day, you would have approved it. That is noise. We conducted a series of experiments to demonstrate the level of noise in thinking. And the first thing that surprised me was how pervasive it is to the point of being inherent. In one test, we presented volunteers with the same situation and asked them to assess the risk. The results: the deviation between assessments did not decrease with intelligence or education. It even increased among those who felt highly confident in their judgment abilities. They thought they were better than others, and therefore they were noisier without even knowing why this happened. Because in each person's mind, there is no common measuring stick. Each person has their own frame of reference, their own cognitive filter, their own emotional frequency. And this makes assessments absolutely personalized products, meaning they cannot be precisely replicated, even by the person who created them. When you grade an essay, you don't just evaluate the content. You're also influenced by the previous essay you read, the one you'll read next, the space you're sitting in, the coffee cup, the room lighting, and even a vague thought about someone who once wrote something similar. You think you're objective, but in fact, you are a collection of perturbations that you yourself cannot measure. And that is a tragedy of expert thinking. Many organizations believe they can fix noise by training employees to judge according to standards. But in reality, training doesn't eliminate noise. It only makes noise more consistent. Instead of everyone deviating in different ways, now everyone deviates in the same direction, and we mistakenly believe there's expert consensus, but that's an illusion. One part of an experiment I conducted was called the Gatekeepers of Knowledge. We had a group of experts assess the risk level of complex business situations. Then, we changed only one factor, the first person to speak. If the first person gave a high assessment, the whole group tended to raise the risk level. If the first person said low, the whole group followed suit. Just one person, one voice was enough to make the entire system noisy, and you wouldn't know it if you didn't measure. You wouldn't see your deviation if you didn't have a replica of yourself to compare. A question that always tormented me was, if I make an important decision, say, investment selection, personnel selection, or a verdict, what percentage of that decision comes from facts, and what percentage comes from mood, intuition, or momentary emotion? No one knows, no one measures, no one is forced to measure. And in that blind spot, noise echoes like a mysterious melody, which both player and listener believe is the right note. I once thought that to improve a decision-making system, simply adding more data and establishing a logical decision process would be enough. But then I realized something, that the deeper I delved, the more it chilled me. The more data, the more people trust their intuition, not their reason. We called this the illusion of understanding. When you're exposed to too much information, you don't realize that your brain starts connecting unrelated dots into a story. And from that story, you form a belief not from facts, but from the narrative structure in your head. This happens at every level, from an employee evaluating a candidate's competence to an executive looking at profit margins. They don't decide based on data, but on how that data creates a sense of order. One of our most shocking findings came from the insurance industry, where everything seems to be quantified by formulas. In a confidential experiment, we gave insurance specialists the same client file, the same set of risk data, not a single number differed. Yet when they proposed insurance premiums, the discrepancy fluctuated by over 50%. You read that right, the same risk, but the suggested premium from two professionals could be worlds apart. Why? Because each person doesn't just look at the data, they look through the lens of emotion, personal experience, and a momentary feeling of fairness. We called this the cognitive frame of reference. And the scary thing is that it's invisible. No one knows where it is, and no one believes it's in their own head. In a series of interviews, I asked specialists, do you think if you did this assessment again next week, you'd get the same result? 90% said, of course. Then we had them redo the same file, but swapped a few meaningless details: client name, skin color, day of the week, or simply the position of text on the page. Result: only 30% maintained their initial judgment. I had to stop and ask myself, if human thinking can change simply because of someone's name, can we still call it logical thinking? And here I want you to imagine a paradox. Intelligent people, good reasoners, those with long experience, they are precisely the ones who are noisier. Because they believe their intuition is trustworthy. Intuition is not bad. I don't deny its role in urgent or creative decisions. But when intuition is used in situations requiring consistency, such as risk assessment, making judgments, or resource allocation, it becomes an uncontrollable conduit for noise. In a meeting among academic examiners, where we simulated grading theses, I observed how members reacted when the first person said, "I'm not impressed with this paper." Immediately, the whole atmosphere changed. Those who hadn't yet formed an opinion suddenly reevaluated the paper in a negative light. No one told them to, but they drifted with the first person's emotion. We measured the noise between groups of examiners. Groups with a negative first speaker tended to be harsher, while groups with an enthusiastic first speaker were strangely more lenient. This isn't logic. It's the effect of emotional contagion, something traditional decision-making models never mention. And this is the most painful truth I have to admit. The human mind is not a measuring system, but an emotional amplifier. It doesn't replicate conclusions based on facts. It replicates moods. And that's why when you present a situation to 10 people, you don't get 10 replicas of the truth, but 10 interpretations written in the language of emotion, based on a reality gently distorted by experience, prejudice, and even heart rate. There's a concept I want you to understand clearly, because it's the foundation for all findings about noise in thinking: internal consistency. In mathematics or physics, you can measure an object multiple times, and if the error in the measurements is low, you say your instrument is stable. But in the human mind, there's no such stability. We are not just wrong, we are wrong in different ways at different times, yet still believe ourselves to be accurate. When you interview two promising candidates on 2 different days, and one is rated higher than the other, do you truly believe that reflects their actual ability, or simply that you had a smooth morning that day, and your mind was more open? We call this phenomenon intrapersonal noise. It's the painful proof that even you are not consistent with yourself in different decisions for the same situation. One of our research team's classic tests was to have financial analysts redo market forecasts after a few weeks. Without telling them these were situations they had already handled, we simply changed a few unimportant details. A new company name, a slightly different image, a difference in formatting. The result was that the discrepancy in forecasts between the 2 attempts by the asterisk same person was often greater than the discrepancy between asterisk different people. In other words, you are even less consistent than others. This made me realize a harsh truth. Self-confidence does not correlate with accuracy, but with a feeling of control. When you feel you have the situation in hand, you think you're right. But the truth might be the opposite. You're just swimming in calm water, unaware of the whirlpool beneath. I once spoke with a renowned cardiologist whom patients trusted implicitly. When we tested him by presenting the same case at 2 different times, he gave 2 opposing treatment plans. When this was revealed, he was taken aback. After a silence, he said, "Perhaps the first time I rushed, or the second time I was too thorough." But he didn't say, "I was wrong." Because we are not trained to admit our inconsistency. We are only taught to admit fault, not noise. And this is why noise is more dangerous than bias. Bias can be identified and corrected, but noise is invisible and slippery. You can label a behavior as sexist or culturally biased, but you cannot label a slight shift in intuition. There's no word to describe it, so it's overlooked. Today's world is full of tools that help analyze data, measure trends, and forecast the future. But there's one thing almost no one measures: the degree of fluctuation in the decision-maker's own thinking. That's why I always recommend that organizations conduct regular noise audits, not to judge who is right or wrong, but to create an internal mirror. When you know that you yourself can be different from your yesterday self, you will begin to design decision-making systems that revolve not just around knowledge, but also around mechanisms for controlling noise. You will start using multiple independent evaluators instead of trusting just one expert. You will record the reasons for a decision instead of just the outcome. You will use standardized evaluation templates instead of letting each person handle it based on their experience. This is not about making the system rigid. This is a courageous act to confront the fluctuating nature of human thought. If one day you find yourself changing a decision, don't rush to blame emotions. Ask yourself if noise is speaking for you. And if you dare to listen to that small, vague, elusive, unnamed voice, perhaps you have begun the path of a decision-maker who is imperfect but aware of that imperfection, and sometimes, that alone is a huge step forward in this noisy world. Part 3. Noise and Predictive Judgments. If you want to see noise in human thinking emerge as clearly as a crack in granite, observe predictive judgments. because there, humans don't just look at reality, they have to envision the future. And it is in that leap between the present and the future that noise reigns. We once designed a series of experiments with senior managers, asking them to assess the likelihood of success for various acquisitions. The same set of information, the same financial metrics. But the assessment results from different experts were horrifyingly different. Some rated them as very promising, while others deemed them high risk and to be avoided. We're not talking about emotional whims, but about trained individuals with MBAs from top schools, working in the same company, sharing the same culture. If consistency isn't there, where is it? The problem lies in this. When predicting the future, people rarely think they are imagining, they think they are analyzing. But in truth, analysis is just the outer cloak of a series of emotions disguised as arguments. Imagine you are an investor. You see a new tech startup, good product, creative team. You look at charts, cash flow, market share estimates, but then in your mind, you start to associate it with a company that collapsed for similar reasons. That image flashes through your mind like a short film. You don't realize it, but your judgment has changed. You call it intuition, but in reality, it's noisy memory, unverified, unquantified, yet impacting like a tiny needle, enough to skew the entire direction. I once believed that with enough information and experience, people would make consistent decisions. But after hundreds of experiments, I had to admit that predictive judgment is the most fertile ground for noise to proliferate. It's not just noise between one person and another, but noise within the same person over time. One director predicts next quarter's revenue will be $20 million. $3 weeks later, with the same information, he says, I think we should expect about $14 million. When asked why, he doesn't say, I changed my mind, but rather, some new things made me feel differently, feel asterisk, not prove. His prediction is actually his mood embodying itself as numbers. When an organization relies on predictive judgments like banks with credit, hospitals with prognoses, companies with strategies, the level of noise in the system becomes a matter of life and death. And the problem is that no organization measures how noisy it is, because no one checks their own repeatability. In a secret experiment at a large bank, we invited multiple credit officers to assess the risk of a loan application. Each worked separately, unaware others were looking at the same documents. We then compared the results. Guess what? The discrepancy between risk forecasts reached 71 points on a scale of 0 to 100. One officer said, "This client seems stable, I rate the risk at 18%. Another felt, "This person will default, I rate it 89%. The issue is that this feeling didn't come from the data, but from how their brains process the data according to distinct schemas. The human brain doesn't just analyze, it tells stories automatically and without permission. And when that story is attributed to the future, it creates a type of prediction that cannot be measured, imagining it under the guise of rationality. I once believed that if you gave people a standardized evaluation framework, a checklist, a risk matrix, a quantitative model, they would be less noisy. But reality shows that people will find ways to interpret even those standardized frameworks in a way that fits the story they have already constructed in their heads. It's not the tool that's wrong, but the way the tool is used has been contaminated by noise before asterisk use. There's a significant difference between bias and noise that I observe most clearly in predictive judgments. Bias is a directional deviation, while noise is an undirected deviation. If you know that an investor is always optimistic, you can adjust their predictions to be more realistic. But if they switch from optimistic to pessimistic depending on their stomach ache this morning, you can do nothing. And even more frightening is that organizational systems don't detect this. They believe their experts are performing consistently, when in reality, instability is disguised by professional language. Let's take an example from the medical field, where prediction often takes the form of clinical judgment. When doctors assess a case, they rely not only on biological data, but also on personal experience, similar past cases, and especially their feeling asterisk about the current case. We tracked hundreds of prognostic judgments and found that two doctors with the same specialty reading the same medical record could give two entirely contradictory life or death prognoses. One might say, I think there's an 80% chance of survival. The other, it's difficult, I'd say 30%. This not only throws patients into a state of belief chaos, but also shatters the idea that science in human hands will always be objective. And I wonder if a clinical prognosis can fluctuate so much, what happens in fields with less hard data, like judgments in recruitment, market strategy, or business model selection? The answer is, noise increases exponentially. In another study, we collected recruitment evaluations from various recruiters for the same candidate. Each recruiter was given the same CV, cover letter, and interview video. The results: one person thought the candidate had leadership qualities, while another rated them as inflexible and unlikely to integrate well. There was no objective reality in their eyes. Each person was painting the candidate's portrait in their own mind and calling it an assessment. If this only happened once, you might consider it an exception. But when you see it repeated across hundreds of situations, thousands of data points, you understand that we are living in a noisy decision-making system that doesn't know it's noisy. A question arises: why don't people realize they are noisy? The answer lies in a phenomenon we call the illusion of internal memory. When you predict something like a stock price rising in the next 3 months and 3 months later the price doesn't actually rise, you don't admit you were wrong. You'll say, "I predicted there was a asterisk possibility asterisk of risk." You forget the specific number you once gave. Your memory has restructured the past to rationalize the present. And so, you learn nothing from that mistake. You are not only noisy when you predict, but also noisy when you recall what you predicted. We once experimented by recording and storing participants' forecasts. Then we had them listen to their own words months later. Almost all were surprised to hear themselves. They said, "I don't think I ever said that," but they had asterisk said it in noise. The danger is not being wrong, but not knowing how you were wrong. No one records all their predictions, no one profiles every assessment. And so, people continue to make decisions, thinking they are improving while revolving around a fog they themselves created. And that fog thickens when organizations start believing, "We have the best people." Yes, they might be good, but they are also as noisy as anyone else. I once worked with a famous investment firm where every strategic prediction was reviewed by a senior advisory board. They called it the risk control wall. But when we asked them to do a simple test, requiring 5 members to independently predict the success rate of a deal, the results showed a fluctuation of almost 60%. And they had never considered this. They believed that when the whole team agreed, they were right. But in reality, it was just a noisy consensus where everyone had unconsciously adjusted their perceptions to not deviate from the majority. When noise hides in consensus, it becomes even harder to detect than bias. There's a paradox that always haunts me when observing how people make predictions. We often don't accept uncertainty, but behave as if we can predict the future with certainty. And that makes noise even more widespread. Let me tell you about another study, this time in the field of justice. Judges were asked to assess the risk of recidivism for incarcerated individuals awaiting trial. The same file, the same personal information, the same criminal history. But when looking at the results of recidivism risk predictions, the degree of difference among judges took my breath away. Some judges thought they should be released immediately, while others kept them in custody, fearing serious risk. I'm not saying they lacked experience. I'm saying that experience in predictive judgment is not immune to noise, it even amplifies it. Why? Because experience is not stored in a person's head like computer data. It's stored in stories, impressions, feelings accumulated from hundreds of situations unrecorded, uncalibrated. And when you face a new situation, you don't pull up a spreadsheet. You summon a series of seemingly familiar feelings and call it intuition. But feelings cannot be verified. And thus, noise is born like a bastard child of memory and confidence. You might think you're reasoning, but you're telling a story. You think you're analyzing, but in reality, you're selectively picking facts to fit the conclusion you've unconsciously preformed. And that's why predictions not only differ between one person and another, but are also inconsistent even within the same person. Try a simple exercise. List 10 predictions you made in the past year about anything finance, personnel, investments, academics, health, etc. Now, try to recall how you felt when you made each prediction, then compare it to what actually happened. I bet you'll find that your memory has edited history. That's not a personal flaw, it's a biological characteristic of the human brain. We call this phenomenon hindsight bias, or the illusion of retrospective rationality. When an event has already occurred, the brain adjusts past thought processes to make the outcome seem as though it should have been predicted. But in reality, you didn't predict anything. You simply adjusted the picture of memory to fit reality. And this, combined with the lack of systematic verification of predictions, makes noise in future judgments undetectable if we don't actively measure it. I'm not saying people can't predict well. I'm saying that even when you predict correctly, you don't know why you were right. And therefore, you learn nothing from that success. You think you were right because you're skilled, but perhaps you just got lucky. You think you were wrong due to lack of information, but perhaps you were only affected by internal noise. And if you don't have a system to record, test, and analyze predictions over time, you are living in a self-delusional loop where both success and failure leave no learning trace. We once proposed a simple method to a large investment company: require all analysts to write down not only their predictions, but also their confidence level in that prediction, along with their reasoning. Then, 6 months later, compare the results. The initial reaction was that it wasn't necessary. The second reaction, when the data was compared, was horrifying. They were not only wrong more often than they thought, but they were most confident in their most inaccurate predictions. And the more confident you are in something wrong, the less motivated you are to correct it. Noise in predictive judgment is not a gentle hum. It's a strong wind that steers the entire organizational ship off course, simply because the captain believes the sea is always calm and the compass is always true. If we want a better decision-making system, it doesn't just require smarter people or more data. It requires a more serious internal reflection mechanism, where every prediction is recorded as a commitment and every deviation is dissected as a lesson, rather than being dismissed with, "I saw that coming." Only then will people truly begin to see noise no longer as a vague concept, but as a real, tangible error that can be fixed. Part 4: How Noise Forms. I once thought that noise was just a random consequence, like dust falling into an otherwise smoothly operating system. But the deeper I delved into the nature of human judgment, the more I realized something not easily accepted. Noise is not an accident. It is a mechanism. It doesn't happen outside the system. It is the system. And worse, it's generated by the very factors we imagine to be the foundation of good thinking. We began Part 4 with a question: what causes human judgments in the same context to fluctuate so much? Why, when given the same problem with the same data, do experts provide answers as if they live in different worlds? The answer isn't in the data. It's in how the brain decodes the data in not just once, but repeatedly, each time drifting with an invisible fluctuation. There are 3 main sources of noise we identified: level noise, pattern noise, and occasion noise. And all 3 hide under the guise of expert thinking, making even the best individuals unaware that they are deviating. First, level noise. This is a type of deviation that occurs when different people use the same scale but evaluate at completely different levels. For example, in a recruitment company, one person gives a candidate an average score of 7, while another typically gives a maximum of 5, even though they are evaluating the same criteria. The scale is one, but the evaluator's range is different. And the problem is, no one talks about it. Each person carries in their head a personal standard that they believe is objective, but in reality, they are using 2 different units of measurement without anyone knowing. We once conducted an experiment in an insurance company where specialists were asked to price the same risk. No one was completely wrong, but when comparing the results, some consistently rated higher than average, others consistently lower. This wasn't because they were ignorant or biased, but because they defined the word risk on entirely different scales. Second, pattern noise. This type of noise occurs when each person interprets the same information differently. For example, one person considers credit history to be the main factor, while another emphasizes current occupation. The same file, but they read it in their own way. Imagine giving a wordless piece of music to 5 musicians and asking them to write a piano accompaniment. Each will write a different melody because they hear different things in the same notes. This is also true for judgments. People don't respond to facts. They respond to the story they believe those facts are telling. And the remarkable thing is that no one is entirely wrong. But when the organization needs a consistent decision, the diversity in interpretation creates noise confusion disguised as creativity. Third, asterisk occasion noise or context noise. This is the most elusive type of noise because it comes from things unrelated to the task: weather, time of day, mood, momentary emotions, even blood sugar levels. We experimented by changing small factors like room lighting, background noise, time of day, and the result was that assessments changed significantly. The same person, the same file, but if they were hungry, they would be harsher. If they had just had a pleasant experience, they would be more generous. This sent shivers down my spine. Judgment, celebrated as the pinnacle of intellect, manipulated by crude factors like noise and blood sugar. You cannot imagine how many serious decisions are made when the decision maker is tired, angry, or distracted. And no one in the organization knows it, no one takes note. This assessment was written when person A just argued with their partner. And so, occasion noise quietly infiltrates, uninvited and unseen. After analyzing these three sources of noise level, pattern, and occasion, I began to understand that noise is not something that can be removed by common sense or moral exhortations. It is a natural consequence of thinking uncontrolled by feedback. People believe that if they make a mistake, they will learn from it. But that's only true when the mistake has clear, immediate consequences and transparent feedback. In most judgments, especially complex ones, feedback either doesn't arrive, arrives too late, or is distorted. You might make a wrong decision today and only realize it 3 months later. But by then, you no longer clearly remember why you chose that option. You've forgotten what you thought, what you felt, what influenced you. And so, noise continues to exist, unnamed, uncorrected. Another factor that nurtures noise, which we observed, is personalization within organizations. That is, when each expert, each department head, each leader is allowed to interpret information in their own way. This creates a culture of flexible assessment, situation-specific assessment, or it depends on the case. It sounds very human, but it is actually fertile ground for noise to flourish. We once entered a life insurance company where specialists were allowed to use their experience to adjust the premium calculation algorithm if they found it unreasonable. They felt proud of this. But when we examined the results, these adjustments did not improve accuracy. Instead, they increased noise by over 30% compared to using the original algorithm without modification. No one intentionally did harm, but they believed they were the exception, someone whose intuition was better than the machine. I don't deny intuition, but I don't believe in unsupervised and unverified intuition. The more I worked with large systems, the more I realized that noise is not just an individual byproduct, but a collective product of a lack of transparency within an organization. When no one knows how others are making decisions, by what criteria, to what extent, each person creates their own frame of reference, and the organization believes it is empowering, when in fact it is fragmenting consistency into disconnected pieces that cannot be stitched back together. The sad thing is, the more an organization prides itself on flexibility, the more room noise has to live. Imagine you are a loan applicant. A credit officer assesses your risk level as low, and you are granted the loan. But if you went to the same bank on a different day and met a different person, you might be rejected not because you changed, but because they are different. You might think this is unfair, and it is. But the system doesn't recognize that unfairness because it doesn't track deviations. No dashboard measures noise at the organizational level because they only measure performance, profit, processing speed. Noise has no KPI, and when nothing is measured, nothing improves. We call this noise in the dark. It doesn't appear in reports, isn't discussed in strategic meetings, isn't named in error logs, but it erodes the system like termites gnawing wood slowly, silently, steadily. By the time the organization realizes it, it's too late. Customers leave due to lack of fairness, employees lose motivation because evaluations feel inconsistent, investment decisions fail because initial judgments were based on emotion rather than data. I remember someone once asked me, "Why don't we recognize noise earlier?" I replied with an image, because noise doesn't hit us in the face like a punch. It bleeds from within the system, a little each day, until we no longer feel it. And that's why I believe that if organizations don't measure noise, they cannot know how precarious their foundation is. Sometimes I wonder, if an organization realizes it's noisy, will it dare to change? Or will it choose to pretend not to see, because acknowledging the problem will force action? And action always comes with inconvenience, loss of control, and even conflict. You know, noise often hides behind beautiful names: freedom of judgment, personal experience, local decision-making power, operational flexibility. No one opposes these things because in any organization, the expert's word always carries weight. But that is also precisely why noise is maintained by capable people. It sounds contradictory, but it's not, because the more confident a person is in their thinking, the less they accept restrictive processes, especially processes that make them conform to others. And if you refuse to conform to others, you will always create your own version. And that is the root of pattern noise. The question is, can we both respect individual judgment and reduce noise in an organization? The answer is yes, but it doesn't happen naturally. It requires redesigning how the organization approaches judgment. We once proposed a model called the structured judgment process, or judgment hygiene process. In this, instead of asking experts to give a final judgment as a black box, the system guides the person through distinct evaluation steps: analyzing factors, assigning weights, evaluating each part, and then synthesizing. This doesn't kill intuition. It only separates intuition from momentary emotions, and more importantly, it helps organizations compare reasons, not just results. A typical example is the recruitment process. Instead of letting recruiters interview and then assign an emotional score, the organization can require them to evaluate each skill on a standardized scale: communication, analysis, adaptability, leadership, with clear definitions for each score level. Then, the total score is calculated automatically. When applying this model in practice, we found that the level of consistency among interviewers almost doubled. Not because they became more alike, but because they began to make decisions based on the same map. If you let everyone drive without a compass, it's not surprising that they arrive at different destinations. It's inevitable. Another point we emphasize is that organizations should consider measuring noise as part of quality auditing, no different from financial auditing. You check financial records because you know that cash flow can be lost. So why don't you check decisions when every faulty decision can cause more long-term damage than any accounting error? Unfortunately, most organizations don't have a memory system for judgments. No one records initial assessments, confidence levels, reasons for decisions, and therefore no one learns anything. We propose recording the mental state at the time of judgment, not for surveillance, but for future comparison. That is the only way to know if one is consistent. And beyond that, it's a way to separate the music from the noise. I end this part with a paradox I consider key. The very systems that believe they are trusting people are often where noise is worst. Because they don't verify people, they don't give people feedback, they let people decide, and they call that trust. But in reality, trust is not ignoring. It is illuminating. Only when you dare to illuminate the dark areas of how judgments are made do you truly empower. Otherwise, you are merely nurturing a system where noise is called by a beautiful name: freedom of thought. Part 5, Improving Judgment ***. We have spent the first 4 parts of this book dissecting the noise in human thinking, from its origins and manifestations to its consequences. But what haunted me most was not the existence of noise, but a simple yet painful question: can we do anything to reduce noise? It's not a theoretical question. It's a question of ethics, of organizational competence, of a person's responsibility when they know that their judgments can cause real harm: financial, emotional, even loss of life. And I must confess, when I began my research journey into noise, I was pessimistic. I once thought noise was inevitable, a consequence of the complexity of human life. But then gradually, small pieces of evidence pulled me out of that darkness. We realized that noise can be faded, not by feeling, but by structure. And the first step on that journey is to break the false belief that I judge better because I have intuition. This is a common illusion in professional organizations. Experienced experts believe they have a nose, an eye, for people, hands-on experience things that quantitative models or computers can never replace. They view intuition as a secret weapon. But the reality, as data shows, is that intuition is only good in environments with frequent, accurate, and unbiased feedback. In most complex situations, like recruitment, investment, or risk assessment, intuition is not much better than random chance. That's why we began researching something people call model prediction. The idea is very simple. Instead of asking an expert, "What do you think?" ask them to build an evaluation model, list relevant factors, assign weights, and let the system calculate the total score. No one forbids them from participating in designing the model, but once the model is formed, they must adhere to it. And the results in most fields are the same. Models are more consistent than humans, less noisy, and often more accurate. A typical example comes from the field of recruitment. A large company in the financial industry once had a very human interview process. Candidates went through open-ended conversations and were scored based on overall impression. They believed this approach provided a comprehensive assessment. But when we applied a structured scoring system skills, experience, work style, with specific scores and a formula for aggregation, the results showed a clear increase in the rate of hiring the right person, and simultaneously, the level of agreement among interviewers also increased. This doesn't remove humanity from decisions. It simply puts emotions back in their rightful place. A reference factor, not a decisive one. We call this method decision hygiene, a deliberate pun. If bacteria are things we don't see but cause illness, then noise is similar. And if we can't see noise, at least we can wash our hands frequently. So, what are the principles of a judgment hygiene system? First, independent assessment asterisk. When multiple people make judgments, they must do so without influencing each other. They should not see others' scores or discuss beforehand, because once the first person speaks, the others will unconsciously adjust. Second, structured process asterisk. Do not assess the overall picture from the beginning. Break down the decision into specific factors, evaluate each part, and then synthesize. This reduces pattern noise, the difference caused by each person interpreting facts in their own way. Third, data separation asterisk. Do not let evaluators see too much information at once, especially information not directly related to the task. For example, when assessing a candidate's competence, seeing a photo, name, or email address can create occasion noise. Present information in structured parts and in a deliberate order. It sounds complex, but it's really no harder than washing your hands. It's just a habit we haven't formed yet. When we first introduced the concept of decision hygiene, many confused it with correcting errors. But in reality, it's a completely different way of thinking. Not fixing errors after detection, but designing processes from the outset so that errors are less likely to occur. Like hand washing in medicine, you don't know where the bacteria are, but you know that if you wash your hands properly, the risk of infection will be greatly reduced. With decisions, it's the same. You don't need to know exactly what's causing noise in your head. Just follow a sufficiently clean process and the noise will decrease. And if I had to choose one core principle for all cognitive hygiene, I would choose separation asterisk. Separate parts of the assessment, separate evaluators, separate each step in the decision-making process. We call it separate to understand. Because when everything is intertwined, you can't tell where the noise comes from. But when you break down judgment into many clear parts, you not only evaluate more accurately, but can also reflect on yourself. One of the experiments that impressed me most was about literary criticism. We gave the same passage to 5 experts, but each was asked to evaluate different factors. One only grammar, one ideas, one style. Only then did we let them give an overall assessment. The level of agreement was significantly higher than when they were free to evaluate everything from the start. Because when you are forced to look at each part separately, you cannot let a general feeling control everything. In an organizational environment, this principle is extremely effective. Imagine a management team appraising an investment project. Instead of everyone stating their opinion, you could break down the factors: market potential, team reliability, technical feasibility, return on investment period. Each person scores each part independently, without discussion, without knowing others' scores, then they synthesize. The result is an assessment that is not only less noisy, but also clear, verifiable, and transparent to the organization itself. A company that adopted this approach discovered something they didn't expect. Those who seemed good at seeing the big picture were often the ones most influenced by emotion. They weren't wrong in their reasoning. They were wrong from the very starting point. This project seems okay. They thought they were seeing the big picture, but in reality, they were only hearing the echo of their first impression. And that's precisely what decision hygiene tries to prevent: the ripple effect, where a single factor, be it a glance, a comment, a piece of data, starts to color all the other parts. Like when you read a CV and see the candidate graduated from a prestigious school, you naturally start to see everything else in the resume as better. Work experience seems deeper, skills seem clearer, career goals seem more mature. But that's not an assessment, that's contamination. The solution is not to eliminate feelings, but to lock them away, keep them in a room until you've assessed each part. Only after everything has been scored separately do you allow yourself to enter that room, listen to the voice of intuition again, and make a combined assessment. But this time, you know you've traveled each leg of the journey with the feet of reason. An organization that knows how to practice decision hygiene is not a place that kills humanity. On the contrary, it's a place where people are used at the right time, in the right way, instead of being swept away by emotion like a rudderless raft. And more than that, it's a place where every decision is not only professional, but also bears the mark of humility. I know I can be wrong, so I choose to take the cleanest path I can build. Someone once asked me, doesn't doing this turn people into machines? If every judgment is proceduralized, where does creativity go? Where is the intuition of the talented? I didn't answer immediately. But then I told them a story about a large hospital where doctors were allowed to freely assess medical records. The rate of diagnostic discrepancy among doctors fluctuated up to 60%. When the management team implemented a structured decision-making process, each symptom scored separately. Each clinical indicator assigned a weight. The level of agreement increased significantly, and the rate of correct diagnosis post-treatment also improved. What was surprising was that the doctors themselves felt relieved. They said, "Now I know what I'm looking at and why I'm making that decision." That is, the process doesn't kill humanity, it only helps people dialogue with themselves. And this, to me, is the foundation of judgment improvement: metacognition. It's the ability to both think and be aware that one is thinking, to both judge and maintain a distance from oneself. Not letting the first impression overwhelm subsequent analyses. Not letting momentary emotions obscure rational structure. And if you want to build a less noisy judgment system, you must foster this not only with tools, but with culture. A culture where people are not afraid to be wrong if mistakes are measured and learned from. A culture where every decision is not a personality trait, but a reasoned fact. A culture where the constant question is not, "Am I right?" but "Is my process clean?" We once helped an investment company build such a culture. Initially, they resisted. They said, "We hire people to make confident decisions, not to fill out forms." But when they applied the judgment hygiene process, evaluating each factor, analyzing each variable, clearly writing down their arguments, and remeasuring after 3 months, something happened. Investment decisions were not only better, but they became teachable, meaning each decision became a lesson that could be reviewed, analyzed, and improved, instead of a powerful nod that no one understood why. And that is the ultimate power of judgment improvement, transforming individual thinking into shareable intelligence. You cannot clone a genius, but you can share a clean process. You cannot erase noise from every individual's mind, but you can build a system that makes it difficult for noise to infiltrate. And if you do that consistently enough, you are not just improving the quality of individual decisions, you are raising the standard of thinking for an entire organization, an industry, a society. The question is not whether this is too idealistic. The question is whether we are brave enough to change habits we once considered instinctive. I have seen it happen. I have witnessed the most seemingly stubborn decision-makers become the most ardent supporters of structured thinking. Because they don't lose their freedom, they only transform freedom into responsibility. And responsibility, if built on transparency and metacognition, is no longer a burden. It becomes a sign of intellectual maturity. Part 6: Optimal Noise. When we presented our findings on noise to organizations, businesses, hospitals, courts, schools the almost immediate first reaction was always, so we need to reduce noise as much as possible. That question sounds perfectly reasonable. But gradually, through hundreds of discussions and thousands of hours of analysis, I began to see a crack emerge in that very thought. Because if we eliminate all noise, we are striving for a completely uniform system with no more fluctuation, no more difference, no more individuality. And it is there that a great paradox gradually reveals itself. When humans make decisions, we not only seek accuracy but also expect empathy, humanity, flexibility. Can a machine replace a judge, a doctor, a teacher if it is always consistent but always emotionless? I'll never forget a conversation with a seasoned judge. After hearing us present data on the level of noise in criminal verdicts that is, for the same crime, sentences varied greatly among different judges, he pondered, then said, "I know that. And perhaps it's a problem, but sometimes that fluctuation is the only thing that preserves humanity and justice." That statement made me pause, because it's true. There are situations where a little inconsistency creates a rationality that goes beyond rules. You can imagine two people convicted of the same act, but one committed the crime due to desperate circumstances, while the other did so out of cold carelessness. If both receive the same sentence, would that truly be fair? In such cases, flexibility, a form of noise, becomes a tool of justice. And this is precisely the concept we call optimal noise. It's not a justification for deviation. It's an acknowledgement that a certain level of noise is unavoidable and should not be eliminated. This leads us to a new kind of question. If not complete elimination, how do we determine the acceptable threshold of noise? The answer, of course, is not found in a single number. It lies in the system's objective. If the system aims for mechanical fairness, like a multiple-choice grading system, then noise should be minimized. But if the system aims for ethical fairness, like judging human beings, then sometimes a little noise is the necessary space for human compassion to speak. We tested this by comparing quantitative models with human decisions in difficult cases. For example, predicting survival for critically ill patients. Models are very good. They are based on hundreds of thousands of cases. They give probabilities. But doctors, real people, don't just look at probabilities. They look into the eyes of family members. They consider personal wishes. They reflect on the meaning of life and death, not just survival percentages. And sometimes, it is precisely that gaze beyond the data that patients need, even if statistically it might be a deviation. This difference is not a flaw, it's a choice, and that is the essence of optimal noise. Not complete elimination, but control and selection of points where people should be flexible and points where the emotionless precision of machines is needed. It is a balance between efficiency and ethics, between structure and emotion, between uniformity and individuality. There is one thing I am increasingly certain of: every improvement in judgment must begin with a choice. Not a choice of tools, not a choice of algorithms, but a choice of what is most important to your system: consistency or empathy. If you choose absolute consistency, you can build an extremely strict system. Everyone assesses the same way. Every decision is made from verified models, no more surprises, no more deviations. But then you will have to face another question. Are you still working with humans, or are you operating an emotional sterilization system? And if you choose empathy, allowing each individual to adjust decisions according to specific circumstances, intuition, and personal experience, then you accept that noise will exist, and you must live with it. But living with it doesn't mean surrender. It means you categorize noise, define good noise, and carefully choose where you are willing to allow it to exist. I once participated in a judicial reform council where people debated fiercely about applying artificial intelligence to sentencing. One group argued that only AI could ensure absolute fairness, free from bias. The other group countered that AI cannot understand human circumstances, cannot put itself in the shoes of the offender. I was silent then, and then I said, both groups are right and both forget the most important thing. The problem is not the tool, but the limits of the tool. AI can impose standard fair sentences, but only humans know when to break that standard to preserve a part of the dignity of the judged. And if so, we need a system that knows when to standardize and when to relax. That is the art of optimal noise. A doctor cannot arbitrarily change a treatment protocol, but in some situations, he needs the right to choose a different path, not because of data, but because of human compassion. and the healthcare system should record that choice as part of its design, rather than viewing it as an error. Similarly, a manager should not make decisions based on momentary emotions. But if he realizes that a candidate is unsuitable for a reason the model didn't foresee, he needs to be trusted. But he also has a responsibility to clearly explain his reasons. And that is the crucial point. Optimal noise is not leniency, it is conditional permission. It sets rules and then specifies concrete thresholds where rules can be bent with oversight, metacognition, and a commitment to transparency. Not everyone is allowed to be noisy, and not all noise is compassion. We introduce this concept to clarify boundaries. Optimal noise is noise that is known, monitored, and accepted as part of the system, not something that secretly reigns as an error no one dares to look at. When you have identified the areas where noise is needed, you will clean up the rest. When you accept that there are reasonable deviations, you will not let unreasonable deviations slip through undetected. And above all, when you understand that a good system is not a system without noise, but a system that knows where the noise is, why it is there, and whether it should exist, then you have stepped out of the murky forest and begun a new path, the path of intellectual maturity. Looking back at the entire journey of studying noise, I no longer see it as a defect of thinking, but as a very human manifestation of thinking. Noise is the price we pay for cognitive freedom, for the ability to imagine, for the capacity to see a situation in multiple ways. But if we must pay a price, at least we must know how much that price is. That is why I wrote this book. Not to turn humans into machines, but to help them realize the points in their thinking that they once thought were sharp, but are actually very prone to deviation. We live in a world where every system relies on human judgment. Courts, hospitals, businesses, schools, all are operated by a series of judgments. And if those judgments are noisy, the ultimate outcome that is, people's real lives will also be noisy. Not all errors come from malice, ignorance, or bias. Many errors come from unnoticed fluctuations. I once witnessed a trial where two judges heard the same case but handed down different sentences simply because one of them had a headache that day. I once saw two doctors review the same X-ray result, both with experience, but gave two different diagnoses not because they saw wrong, but because they felt differently. I once participated in an investment meeting where multi-million-dollar decisions were born from a vague feeling that this team has good chemistry. If we don't recognize such small fragments secretly controlling the entire system, we cannot fix anything, and certainly cannot improve. But now you know that judgment is not a simple act but a sophisticated structure composed of feelings, facts, reasoning models, contextual influences, momentary moods, vague memories, and even unnamed factors. You know that no one is absolutely consistent, not because they are ignorant, but because they are human. You know that there is no way to completely eliminate noise, but we can reduce it, identify it, limit it, and learn to clean the decision-making environment just as we clean our living environment. No one demands that you be absolutely right. But now that you have read this far, you have a new obligation. You are not allowed to be wrong unconsciously. If you have to decide, write down what you are thinking. If you have to evaluate, separate each factor. If you have to predict, try to imagine how many ways you could be wrong. And if you work in an organization, don't just look at the results. Look at the thought process that produced that result. Because ultimately, the question is no longer, am I right? But have I tried my best to think cleanly?